Looking over the soil, he listened carefully and shared his thoughts about how workable it really was. Then the trucks rolled in, dumping millions of bees right into the dry, salty ground of Nevada's desert. Everyone thought it was a terrible idea. Social media went wild, showing videos of farmers releasing bees into what looked more like a dusty wasteland than a farm. People laughed at the idea of saving the bees in a place like this. Mary Jamba explained how Assembly Bill 221 was part of the effort and why bees matter so much in southern Nevada. But not everyone was on board. Some agricultural experts called it cruel. Neighbors thought the farmers had completely lost it. Local news aired segments about Nevada's so-called Crazy Bee Project and predicted a total failure. But just 1 month later, those bees became a key part of Gilcrease Orchard. They helped move pollen from blossom to blossom, which made a huge difference in fertilizing fruit trees. The same people who had mocked the whole thing were now trying to figure out how to do the exact same thing. Turns out, they had all missed something big, something that would end up changing farming as we know it. Back then, Nevada farmers were staring down a crisis that threatened everything they worked for. Growing food in the desert had always been tough, but by 2023, it felt impossible. Each year, crop yields dropped lower. Regular farming methods just couldn't keep up with the extreme changes in weather and soil. The biggest problem wasn't even the dry climate, it was the soil itself. Over time, it had turned more and more alkaline, full of leftover minerals from old lake beds. Most crops couldn't survive in that salty mix. Farmers kept pouring money into fixing the soil, but nothing worked. It was like the ground refused to cooperate. There was one exception: alfalfa. With its purple flowers and long roots, it could reach water deep underground where other plants couldn't. Even better, alfalfa was valuable, especially the seeds. Selling seed brought in much more money than just cutting the hay. And once established, alfalfa helped hold water in the soil, which meant future crops could survive even if a sudden drought hit. But growing alfalfa seeds wasn't easy. The plant only makes seeds when its flowers are pollinated just right. The flower has a tiny built-in trigger, almost like a mini slingshot, that only works when enough pressure is applied. Most bees, especially honeybees, either avoid triggering it or can't manage it at all. It's uncomfortable for them, so they skip it. That meant farmers had wide purple fields full of blooms, but barely any seeds. Every season they were losing thousands of dollars because the flowers weren't getting pollinated the way they needed to be. They knew something had to change, and fast. But the answer they landed on was so strange, it made everyone in the ag world roll their eyes. The solution came from deep within Nevada's own history, involving a type of bee almost no one had heard of. Dr. Clara Martinez was going through some old agricultural studies when she came across something that made her freeze. Buried deep in a study from the 1970s was something that seemed almost too perfect to believe: a native Nevada bee that might be exactly what farmers needed. These bees, called alkali bees, had lived in Nevada's salty soil for thousands of years, and according to the research, were amazing at pollinating alfalfa. Unlike regular honeybees, they didn't live in hives or make honey. These were solitary bees, each female digging her own tunnel in the ground and raising her young in separate little underground chambers. What made Dr. Martinez's heart race was how these bees worked with alfalfa flowers. While honeybees avoided the flowers because of their snapping mechanism, alkali bees didn't seem to mind it at all. In fact, their size and weight were perfect for triggering it. Every time they landed on a flower, the pollination worked, just like that. It was like these bees were built to unlock alfalfa's secrets. But there was a big problem. Alkali bee populations had been nearly wiped out decades ago by pesticides and habitat loss. The very bees that could rescue Nevada's alfalfa fields had mostly vanished. Dr. Martinez realized the only real solution was to bring them back. but that meant figuring out exactly how to create the kind of environment they needed to survive. The research gave some clues. The bees needed salty, slightly moist soil with a very specific texture. The ground had to be soft enough to dig, but firm enough that the tunnels wouldn't collapse. And the salt levels? High enough to keep other bugs away, but somehow just right for the alkali bees. Dr. Martinez started calling farmers, sharing what she'd found. But most thought the whole idea sounded nuts. She told them they'd need to actually salt their land on purpose and then release millions of bees into the ground. Some laughed, others hung up. It didn't sound like farming. It sounded like something out of a weird science movie. Only a few farmers were willing to listen, and out of those, just a handful were desperate enough to try it. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to either pull off something groundbreaking or become the punchline of every farming joke in the state. The experiment that made headlines. When farmer Bill Richardson agreed to try Dr. Martinez's experiment, he had no clue that cameras would soon be rolling. Local reporters showed up just in time to film him releasing millions of bees into what looked like a giant salt patch. The footage hit social media fast, and people everywhere were shaking their heads at Nevada's bee madness. The effort to save the bees was all over the news again. Mary Jamba explained what Assembly Bill 221 was aiming to do and how pollinators fit into Nevada's agriculture. But what people really noticed was Bill. The first step in his plan? Prepping a 5-acre section of his land just for the bees. His team used special tools to get the soil just right. Not too packed, not too loose. Then came the part that made everyone think he'd lost it, spreading thick layers of salt across the whole area. Truck after truck rolled in, dumping piles of salt like they were trying to ruin the ground, not farm it. To outsiders, it looked completely backwards. Locals driving past Bill's farm couldn't believe what they were seeing. People stopped their cars, snapped photos, and posted online about the guy who's actually salting his own land. The jokes and sarcastic comments rolled in fast. Next, Bill quietly installed an underground system that no one could see from the surface. It was a hidden network of pipes and sensors designed to keep the soil at the perfect moisture level for the bees' tunnels. The whole setup was complicated and extremely pricey, needing constant monitoring and adjustments. Critics were quick to point out that Bill was spending more on his underground bee system than most farmers spent on all their irrigation. Then came the part that made national headlines, the bee drop-off. Special trucks arrived, packed with millions of carefully bred alkali bees, ready for release. Workers began releasing them onto the salty desert soil. To onlookers, it looked totally bizarre. Millions of bees being dumped onto what looked like lifeless white ground. Clips of it blew up on social media. People didn't hold back in the comments. "This is animal cruelty," some wrote. Others insisted, "Those bees will be dead in a week." Environmentalists, professors, and online experts chimed in. Some college lectures even used Bill's experiment as a warning about poor agricultural decisions. The criticism got intense. Bill started getting angry emails from strangers accusing him of torturing bees or wasting land on some wild science project. But both he and Dr. Martinez knew they had to wait at least a full month before they could say for sure if it was working, or if it had completely failed. The underground mystery nobody could solve. While everyone above ground kept mocking the so-called bee disaster, something strange and incredible was happening just beneath the surface. The bees, millions of them, weren't dying. They were actually doing something no one expected, thriving. Within just a few days, the alkali bees started behaving in ways that surprised even Dr. Martinez. Instead of flying off in search of better soil, they began digging. One by one, each female bee landed on the salt crust, paused for a moment, then started tunneling straight down. Using their heads and front legs, they pushed through the salty top layer and dug deep into the prepared soil. The tunnels were perfect little circles, going down 12 to 18 inches, then branching out into side chambers underground. What amazed Dr. Martinez most was how the bees seemed to know exactly where to dig. They didn't spread out randomly across the 5 acres. Instead, they created pockets of dense tunnel activity, leaving other areas untouched, almost like they were following a plan no one else could see. And the salt? The thing everyone thought would kill the bees was actually doing the opposite. It helped keep the soil at just the right dampness for digging. It also kept other insects away and made the environment more alkaline, which turned out to protect the baby bees from diseases and parasites that usually caused problems in normal dirt. Underground, each female bee was building a nursery. She'd store pollen and nectar inside, then lay a single egg in each tiny chamber. Those eggs were safe, tucked away in a carefully controlled environment thanks to the salty soil and Bill's quiet irrigation system. But the most surprising thing of all? The bees weren't just surviving, they were multiplying. Each female could produce several new bees, and those bees were already starting to dig their own tunnels in the same area. What started as one strange experiment was turning into something much bigger, a growing, self-sustaining underground bee city that would keep expanding year after year. But the real test was still ahead. Nobody could say for sure if Nevada's strange bee strategy was actually working until the bees started interacting with the alfalfa crop. That's when the outcome, success or total failure, would finally come into focus. The pollination performance. About 3 weeks after Nevada farmers released millions of bees into the desert, scientists began noticing something that completely upended what they thought they knew about pollination. The alfalfa fields near Bill's experimental bee area were showing flower activity patterns that didn't make sense based on traditional farming knowledge. Dr. Martinez set up cameras and monitoring gear throughout the fields to get a closer look at what was happening. And what she caught on video left pollination experts across the country stunned. The alkali bees weren't just visiting the alfalfa blooms, they were interacting with them in a way that no other pollinator could match. When an alkali bee landed on a flower, her whole approach was different from that of honeybees or other species. She would land right in the center and use her weight to press down just enough to trigger the spring-loaded mechanism. Back in the 1940s and 50s, when wild bees couldn't keep up with the expanding alfalfa acreage, this snap was a problem. The petals would pop open so hard they'd startle or even repel most bees. But the alkali bees didn't seem to mind. In fact, they looked like they expected the burst of pollen and didn't flinch when it hit them. The results were incredible. Each alkali bee was successfully pollinating 200 to 300 alfalfa flowers per day. By comparison, honeybees managed around 50 to 75 in the same time. Even more impressive, almost every flower they visited went on to produce a seed. Their success rate was close to 100%. When researchers measured how much pollen each bee carried, the numbers were just as surprising. Alkali bees had 3 times more alfalfa pollen on their bodies than honeybees or even leafcutter bees. That meant they weren't just visiting more flowers, they were also way better at transferring pollen between them. It was their size, their behavior, and their natural match with the alfalfa flower structure that made them so efficient. But there was another advantage too. Field teams noticed that while honeybees and leafcutters had limited working hours, alkali bees stayed busy from early morning until the end of the day. They didn't slow down in Nevada's intense heat. While other bees hid out during the hottest hours, alkali bees just kept going. The result? The bees' pollination range was expanding fast. Bill's 5-acre bee bed was managing to service over 150 acres of alfalfa, well beyond the 100-acre maximum that most farming guides claimed was possible. On some days, researchers even spotted alkali bees working flowers more than 200 acres away from their nest site. But the biggest surprise was still coming. When harvest numbers came in, the data would completely change the minds of those who once mocked the bee dumping plan. The harvest results. When harvest time rolled around, the farmers who'd been ridiculed for dumping bees into desert soil finally got to see what their risk had brought. And it shocked everyone. The alfalfa seed yields from fields pollinated by alkali bees weren't just good, they were record-breaking. For context, to get strong seed production, most experts say you need at least 20,000 leafcutter bees per acre. But the fields serviced by Bill's alkali bees crushed every expectation. Bill Richardson's fields produced an average of 1,850 pounds of alfalfa seed per acre. That's more than double the Nevada average of 600 to 800 pounds per acre using traditional pollination methods. Some areas of his farm even topped 2,000 pounds per acre, numbers that agricultural scientists had once said were flat out impossible under desert conditions. The economic impact was fast and huge. With alfalfa seed selling for about $12 a pound, Bill's improved harvests brought in an extra $15,000 to $18,000 per acre compared to what he was making before. Across his 200-acre alfalfa operation, the alkali bees had added over $2.5 million to his yearly income. But Bill's story was just the start. Word spread quickly across Nevada's farming circles, and the same farmers who once laughed at the bee dumping idea were now calling Bill and asking how to set up their own alkali bee beds. Agricultural extension offices were swamped with questions from people who had joked about salting the earth just a few months earlier. And it wasn't just individual farms seeing results. In areas where alkali bee strategies were adopted, Nevada's total alfalfa seed production shot up by 40%. The state, once barely mentioned in national farming stats, became one of the top alfalfa seed producers in the country. That meant millions more in agricultural revenue flowing into Nevada's economy. Seed companies that used to buy alfalfa seeds from other states suddenly realized Nevada's seeds were not only competitive, but better. Thanks to stronger pollination, the seeds were larger and healthier, with higher germination rates. Nevada-grown alfalfa quickly became a premium product, fetching higher prices in national markets. Even agricultural universities, some of which had criticized the project at first, changed their tune. Research teams were sent to Nevada to study what was going on. Professors who once used Nevada as a bad example were now asking students to write reports on the state's pollination breakthrough. The buzz reached beyond Nevada's borders. Farming communities from California, Utah, and Colorado sent delegations to visit and learn how they could bring alkali bees into their own operations. The place everyone had laughed at for dumping bees into the dirt was suddenly the go-to model for pollination innovation. The copycats who couldn't get it right. As news of Nevada's success spread, neighboring farmers raced to try the same thing. The irony? Many of them were the same people who had made fun of the experiment in the first place. But what looked easy from the outside turned out to be way more complicated than they thought. And the results were costly failures. California farmers were some of the first to jump in. They bought millions of alkali bees and tried building what they thought were suitable bee beds. But California's soil wasn't like Nevada's. Even with salt added, it didn't have the natural alkaline makeup the bees needed. Most of the bees either died or flew off in search of better ground. In Utah, things went wrong for different reasons. Farmers focused on the salt application part, thinking that was the key. But they ignored the underground moisture systems that made the whole thing work. Without that careful water control, the bee beds dried out, or worse, flooded during rains. Entire bee colonies were wiped out. Colorado had its own set of challenges. Big farming co-ops there poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into trying to build artificial alkali bee habitats. They brought in experts, bought specialized equipment, and followed every visible step of the process. But they didn't factor in how altitude and cooler mountain climates would affect bee behavior. The bees that thrived in Nevada's elevation and temperature simply couldn't survive the Colorado conditions. The wave of failed attempts ended up creating something unexpected, a growing demand for Nevada's hard-won knowledge. The same farmers who once laughed at Nevada's bee dumping idea were now paying Nevada consultants thousands of dollars to help them set up their own alkali bee operations. Local consulting firms quickly began offering specialized services to out-of-state farmers who wanted to build successful bee beds. Some states tried shortcuts and paid the price. In Arizona, farmers used artificial salt blends instead of the exact mineral-rich salts found in Nevada's soil. Their bees died within weeks, and the entire investment in bees and site prep was lost. In New Mexico, others skipped the underground watering systems, thinking surface irrigation would be enough. But once the summer heat hit, the bee beds failed completely. These failed attempts made one thing clear. Nevada's system wasn't just about throwing bees on salty ground. It was a carefully designed process involving precise soil prep, the right salt makeup, controlled underground moisture, and a deep understanding of how alkali bees live and behave. Meanwhile, back in Nevada, the original farmers were quietly expanding their bee beds and cashing in, while the rest of the country tried to figure out what they'd missed. The scientific breakthrough. As farmers across the western U.S. struggled to copy Nevada's results, research teams began digging into the science behind what made it work so well. The results changed everything. University researchers studying Nevada's alkali bee beds found population numbers that broke records. Some individual bee beds had over 8 million active female bees, making them the largest known ground-nesting bee colonies ever documented. Even more shocking was the longevity. Some Nevada beds had been running nonstop for more than 45 years, with bee numbers still climbing. That flipped the script on everything scientists thought they knew about managing wild pollinators. Most bee programs needed constant restocking and maintenance. Nevada's were thriving year after year on their own. Productivity data was just as jaw-dropping. A single, well-established alkali bee bed could pollinate 250 to 400 acres of alfalfa, depending on size and density. The biggest one studied was successfully covering over 500 acres and doing it with minimal upkeep costs for the farmer. Genetic studies revealed another key to the bees' success. Nevada's alkali bees had evolved specific traits over thousands of years that made them uniquely suited to the state's soil and climate. Imported bees just couldn't compete. These bees had literally grown up with Nevada's desert, and it showed. Then came the environmental impact reports. Critics had claimed that dumping bees into the desert would damage fragile ecosystems. But the opposite was true. The alkali bee beds were actually boosting local biodiversity. They gave ground-dwelling insects a place to live and created moist pockets in the soil that helped native desert plants thrive. In the end, the idea everyone mocked turned out to be one of the smartest moves in modern farming. It was proof that sometimes the boldest, weirdest ideas are the ones that work. The economic empire that proved everyone wrong. Just months after being written off as a joke, Nevada's bee project delivered harvest numbers that stunned even the biggest critics. The financial success couldn't be denied. Nevada's alfalfa seed industry, once struggling to stay afloat, was now a $400 million per year powerhouse, and most of that growth came directly from the efficiency of alkali bee pollination. Farmers using bee beds were pulling in 3 to 4 times more seed per acre than those still using traditional pollination methods. Individual stories were even more impressive. Bill Richardson, who took the biggest risk at the start, was now making over $4 million a year from alfalfa seed alone. His farm had grown from 200 acres to more than 1,500 acres thanks to the success of his expanding bee bed network. The advantage was huge. Nevada farmers could sell their seeds for lower prices, still make better profits, and deliver higher quality thanks to the bees. Their seeds had better germination, stronger genetics, and higher value in national markets. The ripple effects spread fast. Equipment companies began designing new tools just for building and managing alkali bee beds. What started as a strange idea was now pushing innovation in multiple areas of agriculture. Nevada, once laughed at for dumping bees into the desert, had quietly become a pollination powerhouse that helped reshape modern farming. What do you think about using native species to solve today's farming challenges? Have you ever seen an idea that seemed crazy at first, but ended up working better than anyone expected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.